Solutions, the lively show for people who had polio. Get ready to embark on a journey of empowerment and inspiration. We have episodes every first Wednesday of the month at 10 a.m. Eastern Canada time. Join us for the dynamic, informative talks about polio and your needs. What are your solutions? Join us. As Acceptance by Nina Mago. We recently discovered that there are now changes again to polio 25 to 40 years later. Some medical professionals named it post-polio syndrome or the late effects of polio. Unfortunately, today, not many doctors are still taught about polio because of its supposed eradication. And therefore, even fewer doctors are able to diagnose post-polio syndrome. So our problem is convincing people who had the original polio that they will have more changes as they get older. This is the challenge today all over the world, trying to convince polio survivors that they will experience changes to their body in so many unknown ways. This happens approximately 1% compounded per year. And after 40 years, that's 40% more loss of function than the original polio. Now, I want to talk about ableism and stigma because of these changes. Poliomyelitis did this to me when I was 14 months old. I got better, and now I am again learning how to live with different disabilities. Am I, in fact, an ableist about my own additional disabilities? Do we have ableism in ourselves? Have we felt stigmatized? And as a result, we refuse to change our abilities. Have you reflected on these issues and examined the possibilities of internalized ableism? Ableist is an adjective. If you describe people or their behavior as ableists, you mean that they think people with disabilities are less capable than those without disabilities. A clear example is casting people in a movie and using a non-disabled person to play a character with a disability, or reflecting on your own experiences with mobility and the perception of needing or not needing assistive devices. The term ableist refers to attitudes, actions, or policies that devalue or discriminate against people with disabilities. If you've always used crutches and never felt the need for additional devices, you might be questioning whether that belief is shaped by internalized ableism or societal pressures that prioritize independence over accessibility. Ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. We have internalized ableism, which occurs when individuals with disabilities adopt or accept the negative beliefs and stereotypes that society holds about disability. This might involve doubting your own worth or potential because of their disability or feeling pressured to conform to social standards of normal or able-bodied. Now, we can recognize ableism in ourselves. It's possible to have internalized ableist beliefs if you find yourself struggling with self-acceptance, or if you feel pressured to hide or downplay your additional disabilities, or even ignoring what you have lost in power. This can be a common experience, especially in a society that often idolizes able bodied norms. Now we have self perception. But if you're questioning whether you might be exhibiting ableist attitudes towards your own disability, it's important to recognize that internalized ableism can manifest in various ways, including self doubt, believing that your self worth or abilities are diminished because you have a disability, self stigma, feeling ashamed or embarrassed about your changing disabilities, pressure to conform or to fit in. We try to meet the social expectations or standards of ability, and sometimes at the expense of your own well being. Challenging internalized ableism, reflecting on and questioning your own beliefs about your disability can be a powerful way to address internalized ableism. And then there's self compassion, treating yourself with kindness and recognizing that your changed abilities and worth are not defined by who you are now. We have education and awareness, the ability to learn about ableism and disability rights and how it can help challenge those internalized beliefs and foster a more accepting view of your own abilities. Of course, there are support networks. By engaging with polio support groups, there you can share experiences, gain support from others who do understand your similar challenges. Ken, slide, please. This is a slide about ableism and stigma. These are the different types, and I can send you this chart. It's very interesting, and we need to look at it and make decisions. As I listened again and again to Nina Mago of Rotary World Disability Advocacy talk about stigma, I realized I also had so many feelings about stigma. Why do I feel that way? Is it stigma? What is stigma or shame? Actually, it's a mark of disgrace or discredit associated with a particular condition, quality, or person. For example, being called Hopalong Cassidy or Chester because I walked with a limp, or using my hand on my knee to steady my legs so I wouldn't fall down, or using a brace on that weak leg. Ken, would you please put the video on? Here are some words from Nino.
And also, in addition, stigma is a universal concept, but perceptions of it perceptions constituting stigma, may vary from one society to another, and majorly due to a difference in cultural norms, values, and structures. So what are the types of stigma? So we have health-related stigma. And before I actually get into that, I would like to really invite all of you to look at this presentation from your own point of view, since I am majorly focusing it on epilepsy at the moment. But I'd like you to think about it, all these things that you're seeing on the screen, think about them from your point of view as a person living with a disability or a person caring for someone with a disability, but from your perspective, to be able to understand all these different elements much better. So in terms of the health-related stigma, socially characterized by exclusion, rejection, blame, or devaluation resulting from an adverse social judgment about a person or group based on a health-related condition. Very common for us who have epilepsy. But also the felt stigma looks at the shame, embarrassment, and disgrace of having a condition, or the fear of being discriminated against, often holding a lot of people back from what they would have been able to do. Enacted stigma, on the other hand, is the actual instance of discrimination based on the diagnosis that a person might have. And then the internalized stigma is felt within a person with epilepsy and reflects their feelings, thoughts, beliefs, and fears about being different. In addition, we have the institutionalized stigma, which is basically society's position taken as embodied in our laws and statutes. Then we'd have the reflected stigma, which is by association and affects family members, care, and health workers. Back here where we are, on many occasions, you'll find that someone is reluctant to do something because they fear to be associated with someone who is living with a condition such as this. Interpersonal stigma, on the other hand, looks at the negative actions and reactions of significant others within or external to the family system towards the person living with a diagnosis. Here is a quote that speaks to a lot of the things that we work through as advocates, and many of you might be able to relate to some of this as well. So stigma of epilepsy in this case often leads to discrimination in education, employment, and social interactions. It's a barrier we need to dismantle together. A quote by Dr. Lee. So how does stigma present within our communities? And like I said, I would like you to think about this from your perspective in order to get to really embody these elements well enough. So from a workplace perspective, stigma can present through dismissal or refusal to hire someone. It can be through being paid less while everyone else might be getting a different paycheck. Then stagnation, because on many occasions, still giving epilepsy as an example, all the people that I have met that have active seizures have been doing work as cleaners, and I haven't been able to see anything else other than that. In the home state, how does stigma present? It might be hard to believe, but through separation of utensils, separation of rooms, derogative language that is often used within the space, but is also based on the cultural beliefs and values within that particular home. And then in our health centers, we look at the language and attitudes of medical personnel. Sometimes people are reluctant to touch and treat a person who is living with epilepsy because they believe that they're spiritually afflicted and they don't actually believe that it's a medical condition. And then we also look at it through the unequal access to medical insurance. Many would like to say that people who are living with chronic conditions are the ones who need this insurance the most, but might have the hardest time to acquire it. And then this shouldn't be health centers, but it's our worship spaces. Sometimes it's through the teachings that don't really separate what epilepsy is from anything else, but sometimes it's also through the prayers or casting out demons, which really creates an even deeper stigma, considering the fact that people are looked at as possessed because of that. When it comes to the schools, it appears through bullying, through discrimination, through derogatory language used by teachers and sometimes the students who are not actually given the right direction in regards to not being able to, impact stigma upon their fellow learners. And sometimes it's through the negative attitudes towards children with disabilities within the school space. Here is a quote that I really relate to. A life lived in fear is a life half lived. And every time I think about this particular quote, it just speaks to how much stigma holds people back and just creates a sphere of fear and feelings of disgrace and so many negative elements. And yet, if it's dealt with, then a person can live fully. So as I close my presentation, I would like to call for people to be more open to stigma reduction programs. Because while we are all fighting for inclusion, for all these different things, all those elements are being held back by stigma. They're being held back by people's negative attitudes. They're being held back. And unless we actually deal with the stigma, we won't be able to go very far. So thank you so much all for listening.
And here we are. And then, of course, there is self-stigma. This occurs when individuals internalize those negative stereotype attitudes, which lead to feelings of worthlessness and inferiority. Individuals begin to believe the negative stereotypes about themselves and then withdraw from social interactions or opportunities, further exasperating those feelings of isolation. It's a set of negative and unfair beliefs that a society or group have about something, often affecting individuals. It is tied to negative perceptions and totally unfair judgments. Some people force their negative, unfair beliefs on others. It can be related to mental health, physical disabilities, criminal records, or other personal circumstances. Stigma is everywhere. When someone in our life views us negatively, it causes stigma too. Sometimes we even put stigma on ourselves because of the comments of others. It can lead to self-stigma where people start to believe that they are less worthy because of these labels. Life is a social process. It is a matter of always changing attitudes and behaviors. It creates awareness in ourselves and with others. Practicing self-compassion and affirming your own individual worth can help combat self-stigma. Again, a life lived in fear is a life half lived by Bas Luhrmann. In the first case, let's reflect and understand what has happened to me. Moving towards personal growth and empathy, it can help me develop a deeper understanding of myself and others, and challenge those unfair beliefs. My confidence comes from pushing myself to be out there and finally advocating for myself. Second, we can challenge the unfair beliefs. If you find yourself dealing with self-stigma, practice self-compassion and counter negative self-beliefs with positive affirmations and support. These can be the crucial steps in overcoming those internalized attitudes. In summary, your feelings about stigma are valid and understandable given its powerful and personal impact. It's important to recognize that needing or not needing assistive devices doesn't define a person's worth or abilities. Everyone's needs and experiences are different, and using assistive devices when necessary can be empowering and enhance one's quality of life. Reflecting on these thoughts can be an opportunity to challenge any internal biases and embrace a more inclusive perspective, one that values all forms of accessibility and support. It's okay to use whatever tools or devices to make your life easier or more fulfilling, regardless of how others might perceive it. Stigma affects both individuals and society at large. Recognizing its effects is the first step towards addressing and lessening its impact. This involves personal reflection and changes to foster a more equitable and supportive environment for everyone. There is nothing as empowering as acceptance. Now I have some quotes from Facebook and personal letters. Jan Hartman wrote, I had pain in my good leg from driving and had to get a left foot accelerator for my car. When my brace got too heavy for my needs, I had to stop using it. That transition was good for me. It took me probably 10 years or more to transition from full-time walking to using a power chair occasionally. But glad I started early and slowly. I have avoided surgeries this way. Now I ask myself, why does it take so long to figure this out? Why don't I try to use those devices on a part-time basis? What's stopping me? Me. And Shirley from the UK wrote to me, life is full of challenges, and we all have them. As I always say, I must recalibrate my brain and work out what works best for me to get on with things. I'm sorry to burden you with these issues, Mona, but once I write or talk about them, I can come to terms with the hurdles I face. Thank you again. Take care, and thank you for all the work you do on behalf of polio. And thank you, Shirley. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to throw this out to my audience. If you have any questions, write it in the chat. And in the meantime, I'd like to introduce you to Sandy, one of my polio friends, and here's her story. Take it away.
Hi, Mona. My story is splintered with trauma upon trauma, and each created its own stigma. Stigmas that further traumatized me because I internalized them. It took decades of grit and a community of carers to overcome most of them. I contracted polio when I was 6 months old. My first hospital stay was over a year, and then at months at a time for corrective surgeries on my legs. I wore a back brace to stabilize my back and braces on my legs to help me stand and walk with crutches. When I was strong enough to walk without braces and crutches, my doctors called my recovery remarkable. They were very pleased, as was I, to be given a chance to have a normal life. I so longed for normal because I wanted to do what I saw normal kids doing, fitting in and having fun. I longed to grow up with no labels and with no worries. I hated it when people called me the crippled kid. I hated being gawked at. At school, I would get upset at recess when the bullies called me Chester because of my limp. Chester was the witty sidekick of Sheriff Matt Dillon on Gunsmoke. I liked Chester. His limping when he walked didn't matter to me because that's the only way that I could walk too. Yet, I still took the bullies' taunting to heart. I wanted to be like them, not a bully, but a kid with legs and feet that are normal. My mom would repeat that old adage, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never hurt me. This was so off the wall to a child who knew it wasn't true, and Mummy knew it too. My young mind had already been scarred by Daddy's anger and demeaning innuendos. My medical care cost him a lot of money. If not for me being such a drag on his paycheck, he would be a happy daddy and would not beat Mummy anymore. So I grew up feeling abandoned, ashamed, sad, guilty, fearful, and undeserving. I learned to cope with disappointment and that visible limp that gave me away as damaged. I was too young to understand that my getting polio, Daddy's meanness, other people's gawking, and the bullies' taunts were not my fault. It took years to face them, plus many more that followed, because I'd been predisposed to victimization, self-blame, self-sabotage, and cognitive errors. I didn't realize I was an easy target until it was too late. Getting back on, getting back on my feet took grit, and I had plenty of grit. What I lacked by my mid-30s was energy. I would drag myself into bed at night and then drag myself out of bed in the morning. I had no time for dragging. I was a single parent. I had to be at my best to raise my child and to keep the house in order. I so love being a mom, and it pained me that I didn't measure up. Growing up, I didn't know if my getting sick with polio would make me unable to have children. And I thought, even if I could, I wasn't good enough to be a mom. And yet, instincts like those of a mother bear had taken root in my childhood as I watched Mummy being unable to protect herself or us from Daddy's rages. She tried to leave and even press charges against him, but she'd eventually fall prey to his sweet-talking lies. Every family has dreams and expectations. When bad things happen, the family can congeal and commit to fix what's broken, seek outside resources for guidance, or play the blame game. My mom eventually did leave my dad, but she took the years of trauma that she endured with her. So did her children. When I ran away from home at 16, or I guess I should say, when I hobbled away on crutches, I closed that door behind me and I determined to keep it shut. I wanted a clean slate. Years later, I had to open it with trusted doctors, family and psychiatric. Truth be told, I could never stuff my feelings deep enough or keep them behind the door. They sifted through the keyhole and under the door, sometimes a little at a time and sometimes a flood. Facing them was freeing and made me mentally stronger and more empathetic of myself and of others. And that's when I thought about my dad. I wondered what his life was like growing up. It could explain why he did what he did, but it would not excuse what he did. I was grieving over lost years. Mom had finally left him for good. She was with someone who treated her like my dad should have. Daddy was alone and had been for years. I began to feel bad for him, and that was just as confusing as my decision to go to the phone and break the decades-long silence between us. I started to apologize for not being the daughter he wanted me to be. He was taken aback, and in that moment, the table was righted. He made it as clear as he could that he, not me, is to blame for the bad that happened in our family. He apologized for not being the dad and the husband that he should have been. That was so freeing to hear, and I didn't feel like I was Daddy's burden anymore. In a conversation, I think it was with my mom, I learned that when I came down with polio, my fever got so high that I wasn't moving. When my dad realized just how sick I was, he wished to take my place. I imagine in my mind of what that would look like. Actually, I pictured what I wished for, what I needed to see. He is hovering over the crib. He sees his 6-month-old slipping away. He wants to save me, but he can't. No one can. Polio was the danger, not him. Polio decides who survives and who dies. Daddy's eyes are devoid of anger. They are welling up. His hands are not clenched for a fight. They are outstretched and wanting to sweep me up and cradle me in his arms. These were soothing and tender moments that my younger self had so longed for. When my marriage ended, I became a sole parent of our preschooler. I felt I had to prove that my disability would not get in the way of keeping her safe. Time and again, I showed I was capable, yet my abilities would be questioned. So I tried harder to fit the mold. Household income came from Canada Pension Disability and Ontario Disability. This got us through 2 weeks of the month and not the entire month. So getting a job would help immensely. And if I did really well, we wouldn't need to rely on government assistance anymore. I enrolled in a vocational rehabilitation course provided by the March of Dimes. I lasted a month. I couldn't keep up. I couldn't focus. I didn't have the stamina to stay the course, let alone get fit to rejoin the workforce. That was hard for me to take in. I always succeeded at whatever I'd set out to do, even though it often took me longer than most people to do it. I was an emotional mess. I was so mad at myself for failing my child and making our financial well-being unattainable. I silently prayed, as I always have since I was a little girl, for strength of mind and heart. I had no clue of what to do, where to go, or why I couldn't measure up. I was about to leave the building when I saw Hope, H-O-P-E. It was an unlikely answer in a March of Dimes pamphlet. It wasn't help about where to look for that financial shot in the arm, nor was it what I expected I would ever need to know. But I did need to know, and so does every polio survivor. That little pamphlet described all that I was going through to a T, and still am to this day, 4 decades later. Late effects of poliomyelitis, post-polio syndrome, post-polio sequelae. These are the labels given to this monster that stole my recovery. Doctors said it was remarkable. How were they to know that polio is a life sentence? I learned from that pamphlet that March of Dimes had the backs of polio survivors from the very year I was born, the very same year that I got polio as a 6-month-old. It is that very pamphlet that started my journey to keep polio survivors in the know. I was blindsided, and by the time I learned that this is what was stealing my energy, it had reclaimed my whole being. Unfit to rejoin the workforce, I qualified for government assistance to continue, though I was thankful it was a constant worry of not having enough to make ends meet. I am proof positive that when a person with a disability is stricken with trauma upon trauma, fear of losing control goes into overdrive. I know from experience that people with disabilities are treated differently from people without disabilities instead of equally. I expected certain changes on turning 65, but what I did not expect was more discrimination. My Canada Pension disability changed to Canada Pension retirement, which I anticipated. Ontario disability ended, and I knew it would. What I wasn't expecting was that the full coverage for my mobility devices and in-home service calls for repairs and necessary adjustments also ended. People 65 and over get a welcome to retirement downer. We are to fork out 25% of the costs for the devices we need before the store will even place the order. And for those in-home service calls we need, that too must be prepaid with no discounts. My disability did not retire when I turned 65. I still have it, and I still need financial assistance. I am being penalized for having a disability. My power wheelchair is critical to my mobility and my well-being. It gives me a freedom that I never imagined possible until I gave myself permission to just sit in it and see how it goes. That was well over 25 years ago. I wrongly believed that giving in was a downgrade instead of an upgrade. For years, I'd ignored my weakened body screaming at me, "You idiot, give me a break already." I had unknowingly internalized ableism, and oh, what a relief it is to be rid of it. My power wheelchair gives me a quality of life that makes me smile every day. I would not be able to live in my home independently or safely without it. Mona, my story may be hard for some to hear. It was painful to write it, but so worth doing. I was able to really see my younger self through the lens of my 73-year-old self. I saw how horrifically powerful, depleting, and debilitating stigmatization is in all of its forms. I see those that were forced on me and those I put on myself. And I learned that there are positive takeaways for which I am ever grateful. I never gave up on myself. I never gave up on my faith in God. He is the real source of my strength of will and heart. And I am ever thankful that I'm still on this side of the grass and able to spend the time I have left to use my story to offer hope to others in similar situations. Thank you, Mona, for this opportunity to share.
And thank you, Sandy, for a very, very important story to tell everyone. As we say that acceptance, there is nothing as empowering as acceptance of our abilities. Nina Mago, I want to say thank you for that wonderful phrase. I will use it, and I will cherish the idea of empowering myself and ourself with life and abilities. We can have further discussions. Just write to me. You see my email address there. We need to fight the issues. We need to open the doors. We need to know how you feel when someone helps you. I've worried about how I look all my life. I need help with being a handicapped person and accepting that there are things that I cannot do, or anything else that other polio people need to talk about. We have a couple of comments here. Diane Wall says, thank you, Sandy, for having the courage to share your story. It gives us a good example of the work that is needed for personal growth. We have grown through the years, and we need to continue to grow. Give yourself the empowerment of acceptance and the joy of using assistive devices to encourage ourselves to go further. I want to just say thank you to all for listening to this very empowering story about stigma and acceptance. Thank you very much. I will be back here the first Wednesday of the month in October with more interesting stories to talk about. Thank you all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Bye for now.